Amanda, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Scott.
I feel like when people think Baptist, you're not what they're thinking, right? The white progressive female activist lawyer, right? I mean, do you feel like you single-handedly are crashing Baptist stereotypes all across the country?
Oh, that's a heavy mantle to wear, but I think that Baptists are pretty misunderstood in a lot of ways in this country because I think when most people think about Baptists, they probably think about the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest piece of the Baptist pie, but not even a majority of all Baptists. Baptists are a really diverse group of people with all kinds of theological views, different races and ethnicities, different interpretations of Scripture. So if coming into contact with me and my work helps people think more broadly about Baptists, then that's a happy outcome for me.
Now, you have written a book, How to End Christian Nationalism. You've dedicated a lot of your adult life to this project, to grappling with this phenomena that is really just emerging on some people's radar over the past few years since the emergence of MAGA and Donald Trump. But you are not a sort of secular, rabidly anti-religious person. Something you're somebody that's deeply religious, and you had a conversion experience. You talk in the book about a vibrant Christian faith. So you're really someone that doesn't do this, it seems like, out of some animosity for religion, but out of a deep wellspring of your own faith, right?
That's right. I mean, for my whole life, I have been involved in religious communities, Baptist churches for most of that time. And it really comes out of my upbringing. But yes, in the Baptist movement, we practice something called believer's baptism. That is that I was not baptized as an infant, but rather after I made my own profession of faith, which in my life was at age 7. And so it's something that that has been an incredibly important and core piece of who I am and how I navigate the world and how I make sense of what this life is meant to be. And so my work comes out of that, just like every piece of my life comes out of my religious faith. Including my commitment to religious freedom for all people, which is another distinctive of what it means to be Baptist, is this commitment to religious freedom, and in the United States, a commitment to the separation of church and state. And so that idea of separationism is, again, because of my deep affection for my own faith and my commitment to standing up for everyone else's ability to have religious freedom and to choose their faith or to choose not to be religious, that again comes out of how I understand God to be speaking to us in the world, that our yes to God is meaningless if we don't also have the ability to say no to God, and that faith is only free and authentic when it is freely chosen.
For those of our listeners, and there's a lot of them that wouldn't be particularly religious, or if they are, they've never been to a believer's baptism or seen someone as an adult baptized. This is full immersion. What's the water temperature when that happens? Like, is it lukewarm? Is it room? What do we got going on there?
In most places, I can't speak for all, but in my situation, it was quite balmy. Not quite a hot tub, but certainly not something that's going to be too shocking to the senses. But what is shocking to the senses is to kind of put your faith in someone to dunk you under the water and then bring you back. So you often get kind of this very surprised look on someone's face when they come out of the water. But it again. In a believer's baptism context, it is the symbolism of what we are doing, that we are giving ourselves fully over into a life with Christ, and that we affirm that we believe the central idea of Christianity, that God's love for us all overcomes everything, even human death, and that is symbolized in this beautiful ritual of baptism.
You mentioned in the book that you and a colleague went to the Doral, this event, this Reawaken America event in the Trump Resort, and they were like making baptism great again. Okay, we're baptizing lots of people here. Okay, and you said they're just like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. They're just, there's no liturgy. There's no sort of the robe. They're just dunking people. Did those people get certificates? I mean, could you take that to your church after? I mean, what was the status theologically, liturgically of those baptisms?
Well, I'm glad you brought that out. I did write about this in the book. You know, that was probably of all of the just incredibly over the top and frankly frightening speeches that I heard during that Reawaken America tour event in Miami. I think the most disturbing piece of the entire event were watching these baptisms. There was like a galvanized tub out on the patio and hundreds of people lining up in whatever they had on. Many of them were wearing Trump T-shirts or QAnon T-shirts. And they're right. I mean, they're lining up. And then what was like so striking to me after I just told you kind of how beautiful I think the symbolism of believers' baptism is. I mean, what was so striking is there was absolutely no relationship between the people in line and the people who were doing the dunking, and also no words exchanged. There was no sense of, there was, to me, the only thing that was anything like my experience was the actually going under the water. Everything else was completely divorced from any kind of Christian faith or idea of what people were being baptized into other than Trumpism.
You know, a lot of among the young people in hookup culture, and you know, I'm an old man, so I don't know that much about this, but they use this term NSA, right? No strings attached. Like, we're just going to hook up and no strings attached. This sounds like NSA baptisms, right? There were no strings attached. You just kind of went in there. They dunked you and you went on your way, and you didn't even exchange phone numbers.
Yeah, or you know, I would say the only thing is what the strings are just not to Christianity. The strings are to something else. The strings are to kind of a cultish, devotion to a strongman leader and being willing to do anything that movement calls on you to do. That's the concerning piece to me, is kind of using the symbolism, this religious symbolism, to try to tie people to something that it actually has no bearing or connection to Christian faith.
Your tradition, the Baptist tradition, you have claim to Thomas Hollis, to the first English-speaking, or at least the first written declaration of religious freedom or advocacy for it, right? In the English language. He this is to King James, right?
Right. So early 17th century, co-founder of the Baptist movement, Thomas Helwys or Elwys, depending on how you pronounce it. And he wrote what is considered to be the first defense of universal religious freedom in the English language. And in it, he says directly to King James I, as in the King James Bible, the king has nothing to do with religion. And this was a radical statement, a revolutionary statement to make to the English monarch. And the monarchy had Thomas Helwys arrested for this, and he died in Newgate Prison. So, it is in the Baptist DNA to advocate for religious freedom for all people, to speak truth to power, to say that earthly power has nothing to do with religion and God's law. And it is out of this tradition that the work that I do and my colleagues and all of those who support us at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, this is our heritage, and this is what we are trying to speak to and live into in this fraught moment.
Do you think this confrontation with Thomas Hollis, this firebrand Baptist activist and lawyer, do you think this confrontation with King James is where the relationship between Baptists and gays went downhill? And is this why most of my gay male friends today prefer the Episcopal Church? I mean, they don't find them in the Baptist Church. I mean, was this the moment?
I've never thought about that story from that frame, but I think that it's really, I think that this is his, I'm so glad you brought this history up for our conversation, Scott, because this is history that a lot of people, including a lot of Baptists, frankly, do not know, right? And I think this being willing to speak outside of power, I think in a lot of ways, many Baptists have lost our way by being too tightly tied to those in power, that power is seductive in a way that really draws us away from what our faith teaches us, that religious freedom is only free when it's free from all control, all human control, including government control.
You, in the book, lay out kind of a rubric for Christian nationalism, because I think this is important, because I think when so many people, if you ask them, should America be a Christian nation, a lot of people just say, sure, yeah, it sounds great, under God, pledge allegiance, don't take that off. But then when you look into the sort of actually what people mean, my friend Robert Jones over at PRI, or the good folks at Pew, kind of the gold standard on this stuff, when they start teasing this out, people are like, oh, no, I don't want the Bible making laws, or, oh, no, I don't want Muslims to have to pledge allegiance to Jesus, or, oh, no, right? So this is a thorny thing. And you say, look, there's like about, maybe 20% who are super big Christian nationalists. Yeah, everybody, yay, Jesus, brand everybody with crosses on their forehead or whatever. And then there's a group of people on the other side that are a minority, that are a sizable minority, like the first group, that are really actively working against it. And then the rest of the people are somewhere in the middle, and they're just sort of saying, well, I like a little bit of Christianity, I like a little religion in my state, but I want my gay nephew to have his rights. I mean, how do you use this typological work and descriptive work in your work? I mean, how important is it to understand the animal and the nuances of the animal when you're working to combat it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're really speaking to this great research that's been done by PRRI and even before PRI by sociologists of religion like Andrew White.
Another great Baptist, by the way, Robert Jones, right?
Exactly.
Also married to a Jew, I think to a Jewish woman, interreligiously married. That's like right. Yourself.
That's right. And they've really, I think, brought a lot of understanding to how we think about how Christian nationalism shows up in our public and in the public idea right now, and I define Christian nationalism as this political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. And when you think about an ideology, it is something that we each have an opportunity every day to either embrace or reject. So these surveys are kind of a snapshot in time, and they do plot people along a continuum or orientations towards Christian nationalism. And you rightly point out that the majority of the American people, about 60%, are somewhere in the middle. They're either resisting Christian nationalism or they're sympathetic to it, but they haven't fully either embraced or rejected it. And I think that is really telling about the problems that we face right now. It is because we, as a people, have never fully faced Christian nationalism, including the white supremacy that's inherent in it. This idea of whiteness as somehow an ethno-national identity that defines us, and then wrapping that up with Christianity. And that kind of sympathy towards it, or kind of soft complicity with it, that shows up in examples of civil religion, examples that you point out, In God We Trust, One Nation Under God. These slogans, by the way, were not original to the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention God at all, and the only place it mentions religion is to prohibit religious tests for public office. So the actual framers of the U.S. Constitution understood the dangers of government establishment of religion. It is in more modern places, especially in the 1950s. When
post-war, right?
Exactly.
Post-war, anti-communism, right? I mean, all of a sudden, to be American meant to. What did Eisenhower say? another Baptist, right? Said, you guys say, I mean, this is the who's who of Baptists in American history and European history. No, but didn't Eisenhower say something akin to be American is to believe in whatever, object that is. I mean, something to that effect, right? Like basically, to be an American is to be a believer. It's not to be an atheist. It's not to be a communist.
Right, and that is like a definition of Christian nationalism. This idea that to be a real American, that one has to be a Christian, and really now not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that align with certain conservative political priorities. And I want to say clearly, just to have conservative political views does not make one someone who's embracing Christian nationalism. But to say
you talk
to be
in
a
your
real
book,
American, you have to have it. That is.
Yeah, you talk in your book. One of the folks you have is a lifelong conservative who's been an activist against it, right? I mean, there are evangelical pastors. My friend David French is, I mean, look, there is not a more conservative Christian than my friend David French. I mean, this guy has dyed in the wool, pro-life student group at Harvard, signed up for Iraq. I mean, this guy's bona fides are, but he's been an ardent voice against Christian nationalism, right? There are these folks on the right.
That's right, because in his view and a lot of other people's views, there's room for all of us with our differing political views and our differing religious views in our pluralistic democracy. That one's religious perspectives or political perspectives, that those should not define whether one is fully American or not. And I think that speaks to the kind of open society and pluralistic society that we want now, and that I honestly believe, despite all of their failings, that the framers were trying to design for us at the time. And if we are really going to live into the fullness of that vision for pluralism, then we have to reject Christian nationalism outright. And that means moving, some of these people who are sympathetic or merely resisting Christian nationalism more fully into that rejecting column. And that's really the focus of my work, the work of BJC and Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and what I'm trying to accomplish in this book is to give everyday people the tools they need to talk to people in their communities and to actively work to reject Christian nationalism.
I'm wondering, you talk about, in the book, you talk about Bishop Michael Curry's 3 steps, Episcopal bishop, 3 steps to confronting Christian nationalism. And one is recentering Christianity on the teachings and example of Jesus. And then also he talks about calling on our common humanity and also rebuilding relationships with people across political and religious differences. I'm wondering though, as I was reading your book, in my head is rattling around a book I love, T.S. Eliot's Notes Toward an Understanding of Culture. And in it, he basically says secular culture is just not possible, that every culture has some sort of spiritual animating spirit, right? And this is what he attributes as the rise of Christianity. Basically, the spirituality of antiquity was just in decline, and Christianity kind of filled the vacuum. And he says, okay, you want the exception that proves the rule, look at Stalinism. It's state religion, right? Even if you're atheist, you've got to have religious devotion. If you combat Christian nationalism, if you get it off the table and you wind up keeping it at bay, what do you fill the religious yearning of the culture with, right? Because we used to have civil religion. King was able to employ pretty general language, right, around a little bit of the founding fathers, a little bit of the Hebrew Bible, and people could get behind that and help fuel the civil rights movement. I don't know that we have the shared value system or framework to reconstruct that. I mean, do we have to fill it with something, or could we just have a sort of secular liberal country? Or will that fill up with something else?
Well, it's an interesting question, and frankly, one that I haven't really had phrased to me in this way before. But what I'm thinking about, I wonder if inherent in some of those critiques or questions is this idea that I think is false, that Christianity or even religion has a monopoly on values and morality. because I do think that we can have shared values and shared morality while we differ in our religious views. And, I think one of those ideas is love, right? I don't think that Christianity is the only religion that reflects love, nor do I think there are plenty of people who are explicitly non-religious, atheistic, who understand love and morality and what it means to be a good person. And so I think that some of those core values of just humanity could provide a framework for us to live together. And I think one thing that's getting in our way is this idea that there is only one religion that can speak for a whole people, right? And that if we could kind of understand and give ourselves the freedom, each person the freedom to choose what makes sense for them when it comes to religion, and then focus on what can unite us in our shared humanity, that would be a more helpful way forward. Now, my own faith provides a framework for me for understanding that, and in this idea of the Imago Dei, the idea that the image of God is in every other living person, and that idea that therefore every other living person deserves my love and respect, is a way that animates me in the world, and animates a lot of other Christians and other people of faith. And so, our personal religion can animate the way that we interact with the world without thinking that that's the only way that one can show love, respect, and have a shared sense of morality.
Yeah, I don't mean that to suggest, in quoting Eliot there, that religion has a monopoly on values talk or ethics or meaning making, right? But you need symbols, you need stories, right? You compare the story that was told in this last election. My candidate, who lost, unfortunately who lost, so I volunteered for it and stuff. She didn't have this kind of story. Trump had a story. It might have been a false story. It might have been a story that doesn't capitalize on the better angels. And maybe like, we're going to make it all great again. You're going to be winning, and everything was powerful. But in some sense, I just had a guest on, a philosopher from the University of Vermont, who wrote a book about capitalism called Pure Excess, one of the best things, psychoanalytic treatment of capitalism. But one of the things he talks about is this capitalism's just false promises of more and more and more and more. But I felt like at the end of the day, the story that the left ran was, hey, Trump's going to ruin the economy. We can get you more excess and trans bathrooms. And look, even Liz Cheney says I'm a better option. That's just not a great story, right? I mean,
sure.
Yeah. I think, how do we tell a better story? Right. Yeah. Or how do you, because it seems like the way that you would beat the Christian nationalists is to have a more compelling story, one that sucks the oxygen out of their room a little bit and gets people, and often abstract universal talk about love and the human condition. I mean, this is stuff. Ernst Troeltsch, right, in The Absoluteness of Christianity, he's forced to sort of narrow in on the particularness of Jesus, even though he doesn't want to, because he's like, people just don't worship ideas, right? They need symbols and stories and myths and liturgies. And how do you come up with a better one? Which seems like liberals were just not good at that.
Well, okay, so that makes makes sense to me, right? This idea that we do need better storytellers. We need a sense of a shared narrative. And that is not something that is going to be cooked up in a laboratory. Right. And that's not something that AI is going to spit out for us. That is something I believe that will emerge from true human relationship. And one way, I think this is one way that I think, both parties have lost their way, but I think particularly the Democratic Party is not listening well to people, not really understanding where people are feeling the most hurt, where people are finding their joys, where people are finding their meaning making. And I don't think it's necessarily up to the political party to solve all of those pieces, but rather for us as an American people to rebuild human relationships, to live and support one another, to listen well to people who disagree with us, and to understand. Then I think that the story and the narrative will emerge from the relationships, and therefore that's one of the ways that I talk about in the book that I think is really necessary to dismantling Christian nationalism is to get involved with organizing for change in our communities. That is not just about the public policies that will shift and become more just and lead to a more flourishing life for all people, but also about the relationships that are built along the way. This idea that we will actually get to know our neighbors again and get to know their struggles and their joys and how we can best live together. And I don't think that this is pie in the sky. In fact, I think this is absolutely what we all need to be doing in this moment of great danger for our democracy. That really building the democracy doesn't start with rebuilding our institutions, but rebuilding our relationships with one another.
In the book, you talk about, you mentioned this quote by Lauren Boebert, who, with all due respect, caught on video, doesn't seem like a bad date. But she says that the church is supposed to direct the government, not the other way around, right? And that largely, and I think you quote Mike Johnson or something to the effect that, oh, come on, separation of church and state isn't in the Constitution, which of course it isn't. It comes from the letter between Jefferson and I forget, the Baptist in Rhode Island, the pastor, another Baptist. This is like the Baptist greatest hits hour. It really is. Yeah. But it has become, I mean, that idea since the 50s, I forget the decision in the courts, but has been sort of the not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well, right? The normative way we negotiate church-state relations. How do you respond when people inundate you with because you have Dr. Google now, right? Everybody can go founders on religion, and they come up with these quotes, right, that sound like America was meant to be the New Jerusalem, and kids were just meant to sweat Jesus. And I mean, how do you the Lauren Boeberts of the world, right? Who I mean, wow. I mean, this is not what the founders intended for Congress, I'm sure. I'm not talking about the misogyny, my friends. I'm talking about just wow. But how do you engage folks like that?
Yeah, well, and I think we all meet people, maybe not exactly like Lauren Boebert, but people who are kind of espousing this Christian nation mythology, this history by anecdote, which, by the way, is not real history. But you can cherry pick from founders' quotes to say just about any argument you're trying to prove. And so often my favorite place to go is the constitutional text itself. And I mentioned earlier that there is no mention of Christianity or God in the U.S. Constitution. If they were indeed trying to start a Christian nation, one might expect that they would say so in the founding document. And in fact, the only time they mention religion is to prohibit religious tests for public office. So I argue, look, that's about the most ineffective way possible to form a Christian nation, to say, we're not going to ask you what your religion is before you serve in this government. But beyond that, I do take issue with the idea that there is no separation of church and state, even in the First Amendment, because while those exact words aren't there, the ideas certainly are. This idea that we protect religious freedom by saying that government will not establish religion, but we will have free exercise for all people. I mean, in the same way, separation of powers isn't in the U.S. Constitution, but the ideas, those exact words are not there, but the ideas are. So I think that these are false statements coming from people who have sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, and we have to call them out as such, that we made a very deliberate choice at the founding of this country to disestablish religion, and that we go against those founding principles in this moment at our great peril, including, by the way, the religious freedom of Christians, that not in the way that President Trump and his allies are arguing, but rather rather by their actions, we're seeing that religious freedom of Christians is very much at threat in this moment, as well as the religious freedom of people from other faiths and people who are non-religious as well.
Isn't it weird, though, that right now we're in the country that was founded on anti-establishment, right?
Right.
And if you looked at, let's say you're a Muslim, and where you had the most religious freedom, if it was the United States, France, or the UK, it would be the UK, where there's an established church and where the crown appoints, through the prime minister, appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? Isn't that strange that's maybe you don't need establishment, because France, which is completely secular, has more stringent restrictions for Muslims on what they can do, what they can wear, than a country that we fought a revolution for, at the heart of which one of the issues was establishment and things like this. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I still think that the system that we have set up of a disestablished religion is the best system for religious freedom for all people. And you are right that we have a huge problem with anti-Muslim bias in this country, Islamophobia in this country. But the answer is not an established religion of any kind, but rather a commitment to taking on Islamophobia whenever we see it. And part of what is driving anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Sikh bias, anti-Hindu bias, all of these things is Christian nationalism, is this, kind of persistent idea, despite what the laws and the constitutions of this country say, that to be fully American, that one has to be Christian. And if we don't continue to push back against those ideas and policies that are being pushed by those ideas, then we will continue to have big problems with Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias in this country. And, for an example, right, is this propagation of all of these laws in public schools across this country, places that are, for instance, like Louisiana, that are insisting on the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms, sends this idea that if the Ten Commandments are not part of a core piece of your holy life, that somehow that you don't really belong here.
Look,
right?
We know, Amanda, we know. Okay, come on, we know. If there's no 10 Commandments on the wall, all the kids go gay. It just happened, right? They just the teacher turns gay. Everyone turns. I've seen it happen, right? Everyone's heterosexual. At the third graders, they all know their sexual identities. You pull the curtains down, rainbow unicorns. I've seen it.
How could I forget? Okay, well, but instead, right? Instead, the reason they're saying is this, again, false idea that somehow the Ten Commandments is the basis of all American law. That is a lie. That is not the truth. But that continues to be repeated. I've called it a zombie myth that will not die. And so therefore we have to push back against that, because again, it's not just because it takes Holy Scripture, the government tries to appropriate it for itself, stealing kind of the religious significance of it, and how insulting that is to religious people. But it also is this signal that's being sent in sometimes very clear and sometimes more subliminal ways that, if you don't believe this, that you don't belong here. And that's wrong. And we have to say that that's wrong and continue to push back against it.
We don't have this. We have the separation of church and state, but we don't have the separation of church and politics, certainly. It's interesting, though, when I talk to my British friends, again, who we sort of took up arms against the oppressor, right? You could argue in Romans 13, was that a justified war? Probably aren't allowed to kill other Christians to get better break on your taxes. But let's say it was legitimate. In the UK, they just don't give a damn about whether the prime minister, the candidate, is religious, right? Whether they're the Tories or the Liberals, they don't. The Labor, they don't really care, right? They don't have to do these perfunctory religious demonstrations. Yet here, where we have the separation of churches, you have to do it, right? Bernie Sanders, it was a political suicide to say he was agnostic, right? Why are the folks that we broke away from so much better at religious freedom than we are, seemingly?
Well, I don't know that they're better at religious freedom, but they are better at perhaps. I agree with you. I think it's gross that people have to, if this is indeed the case, that people have to prove their religious bona fides in order to be elected to office. Because again, that's not what's in the U.S. Constitution. No religious test for public office. And so I think that's really up to American voters to stop doing that and to push back against that when it's one thing if someone, for instance, if I were to run for office, I've already said, that my faith is an important part of who I am. It's how it animates my life. If I want to talk about that in some way that is, again, respectful of our pluralistic democracy, I have the freedom to do so. We don't have to scrub religion or religious references from our political discourse. But I do talk, and I write about this in the book. If we are running for office, people who run for office and people who hold office, I think, have an extra duty in their political speech to make clear that they are they're elected and represented to serve everyone, regardless of religion. And so I do think that the Christian nationalism that is inherent in our culture is driving us away from these constitutional ideals and away from what's needed for robust religious freedom in a pluralistic democracy. And, look, I'm not an expert on the British system. I can't really speak completely to how religious freedom is
certainly very
there.
Fun to watch Parliament on TV, though, right? When they shout at the Prime Minister, it's fantastic.
But I think, the way that we have protected free exercise of religion in this country by standing against its establishment has allowed for a flourishing of a religious sector in this country for centuries, right? And not just Christians, but other faiths as well. But even among Christian denominations, incredible diversity of Christian expression in this country. And that's something that I think should be celebrated. And at the same time, that does mean in a country that has a majority of Christians still, that those of us in the majority have to have, I think, extra care in the way that we wield our majority status, particularly in areas of politics and government.
You've just said that your faith's important to you. Would you say you have a personal relationship with Jesus?
Yes. Yeah, I do. That's something I think that's part of, my tradition is a sense of prayer and commitment to the life of Jesus. Following Jesus is how we talk about it. How do I follow Jesus's example in the life that I live today?
Have you ever evangelized somebody? Have you ever invited somebody to a personal relationship with Jesus?
I think of evangelism as just the way that I live my life. So I am not about converting other people, but I am about sharing how my faith has influenced me and what impact that has on people around me. I don't always know, right? So I think it's not, to me, I'm not about forcing my faith on other people, but living my life in what I hope is an authentic way. And if that is inspiring to people to want to learn more about what this faith is, then I think that is a form of evangelism that is not so in your face and certainly not coercive, right? That's if anyone takes anything, when I think about faith and religious freedom, it cannot be coercive because then it is not freely chosen.
I have a Jewish friend, Leo Leibowitz, used to host the Unorthodox podcast, which was the best Jewish podcast out there. But he always said he looked at Christian evangelization like if somebody was recommending like a good cardiologist, like, hey, I've got a great doctor, you should see him. Which I thought was pretty hilarious. I love being evangelized. In fact, like when the Mormons skip my door, I'm hurt. I'm like, don't you think I would be good for the team? I think I have abandonment issues. Like I want to feel wanted. So I think that's it's rooted in that. I want to read a couple sentences to you from a book by Patrick Deneen. Do you know Deneen's work? He's at Notre Dame.
I haven't read a lot, but I'd love to hear the sentences.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Deneen wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed. It's not, and he's not talking about like left wing democratic politics. He's talking about classical Enlightenment liberalism, the sort of stuff that would give us religious freedom and the constitutional republics coming out of the Enlightenment that we're so accustomed to. And this is a book that Obama put on his reading list, and it came out in 2018. It's stuff that I'm engaged. Ezra Klein has had him on the podcast, and it's challenging stuff. But I'll just read you this, and you can tell me what you think. Nearly every one of the promises that were made by the architects and creators of liberalism has been shattered. The liberal state expands to control nearly every aspect of life, while citizens regard government as a distant and uncontrollable power, one that only extends their sense of powerlessness by relentlessly advancing the project of globalization. The only rights that seem secured today belong to those with sufficient wealth and position to protect them. And their autonomy, including rights of property, the franchise, and its concomitant control over representative institutions, religious liberty, free speech, and security in one's papers and abode, is increasingly compromised by legal intent or technological fait accompli. The economy favors a new meritocracy that perpetuates its advantages through generational succession, shored up by an educational system that relentlessly sifts winners from losers. A growing distance between liberalism's claims and its actually increasing, and its actuality increasingly spurs doubts about those claims rather than engendering trust that the gap will be narrowed. Liberalism has failed not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. It has failed because it succeeded. And he goes on to sort of an Enlightenment, individualistic critiques and stuff. But I wonder, I read that and it seems challenging to me. And I wonder, is this why MAGA's, is this why the party that's threatening religious liberty is winning? Because so many people feel left out of the liberal project, of the Enlightenment project. And they're thinking, free speech, freedom of religion, liberalism, get the prices of eggs down and make me feel like the world's not ending.
Yeah. Well, I do think that is incredibly thought-provoking and kind of gets to some of the ways that I've been thinking about this moment and about what happened with the election. I already referenced the fact that I didn't think the Democratic Party was listening well to people's needs. And now, we're not even, 2 months into the Trump administration, and we're seeing, how the social safety net is being ripped out from beneath people in this moment. And I think a thought that I've been kind of mulling over recently is I don't think there is a big enough social safety net to catch everyone who's falling through the gaps of income inequality in this country, and greed, right? And I think that growing inequality that has been growing for decades and that has been accelerated in recent years was even more exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we saw how disproportionately that fell on certain communities, and how fragile, frankly, we all are to what happens when there is just these chasms between those who have the most and everyone else. To me, that's where our society is failing right now, and that there is not a single government program that can save all of that. And instead, I do think in this moment that turning to each other and understanding how do we support ourselves in our communities to get us through the crisis that is at our doorstep, that a new order will emerge from this time. And that's kind of where my hope and my heart and my head is right now, is really this firm belief that our communities, we are seeing like maybe never before how much we need each other, and not looking to any one government program to solve it. At the same time, we can see that what's happening with our government is is not only chaotic but driving us into what I think is a real calamity for ourselves and for the world. So, if all of that goes into is this liberalism's fault? I don't know about that, but I do think it is about greed and concentrating wealth in the hands of just a few to the detriment of most everyone else.
Yeah, I think Deneen here is saying that, look, you've got a system that was designed to maximize individual freedom, to make every person sort of autonomous, to make every person pursuant of their own ends, right? One that's antagonistic to not just state authority but religious authority. And I mean, I think Stanley Hauerwas has said many of the same things, and a lot of other Christians, John Howard Yoder. This argument's not unique, but that really that the liberal project ultimately makes for pretty individualistic and shallow people.
Yeah, and I do think this idea of rampant individualism is not good for any society, and this idea of the importance of the collective in this moment is emerging. And I don't think that the idea of I think religious freedom is actually hand in hand with that idea of the collective, right? Like, I think sometimes when we reduce religious freedom to a constitutional right, we lose something, because the idea of it is my right to religious freedom, I think, loses sight of the idea that religious freedom is actually something that is good for the community. In my religious tradition, the Ode to Freedom is Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free, but do not use your freedom for self-indulgence, but rather in love for one another become servants to one another." That's the idea of freedom, I think, that is animating, of course, to me and to my tradition, but also can help us understand what religious freedom looks like when we owe it to one another, that it's not just something that is mine to hoard, but rather is good for the entire community.
Galatians is also the only book in the New Testament that mentions castration, right? I mean, he really says, look, if you want to go get a circumcision, just go ahead and do the whole thing, which I thought, I would love to know Paul's tone when he's writing that. So much is really conveyed and or lost in tone, right? I love that you said that religious liberty goes hand in hand with the collective, because I think for most people that's not the case, right? I mean, I think there's this. David Brooks wrote this piece years ago, and he's trading off lots of other people, I'm sure, like Joseph Ellis, one of my favorite historians, and other. But in the American Constitutional and Ethos Project, you're either a Jeffersonian or a Hamiltonian, right? And the Jeffersonians are sort of, don't tread on me, the yeoman farmer, authoritarianism, that's the big enemy, that's the problem, and all government is sort of one extension of authoritarianism or another. And Hamilton's very different, a little more cosmopolitan, a little more collective. It really thinks that the country stands or falls with a collective destiny. It tends to like expertise, right? And that, I mean, we're seeing that. I mean, it's strange to link Trump with Jefferson, right? But because, well, one could read, and the other, it's always, I always jokingly say, it's like, I don't like when people compare Trump to Mussolini, because it's really not fair to Mussolini. Mussolini read books. I mean, it's that's not really fair to El Duce. No, but I mean, I think what we see with Christian nationalism and Trumpism and MAGA is really this Jeffersonian impulse on steroids, right? It's the Jeffersonian impulse without governors on it, without the dialectic of the Hamilton. I mean, for the best of our country, it seems like there's a dialectical tension between the Jefferson and Hamiltonian visions, right? And the constitutional framework is a tension, right, between just how much central authority, and there's a give and take between Madison and Madison's kind of in the middle, and the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians and the Adams types. It seems like that creative tension is breaking, and the radical individualism is sort of fueling the MAGA stuff and the threat to religious freedom. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, and I mean, I think some constitutional history is helpful here because if we think about the Bill of Rights, we think about it coming after, of course, the full U.S. Constitution, as an idea that what was in the Constitution itself was not enough. And so, when I think about the Bill of Rights, particularly the religion clauses of the First Amendment, I think about it as a floor, not a ceiling, right? Like we need at least this in order to live well together, but we actually need more than that to achieve religious freedom. And so a rights-based idea of religious freedom is the least of what we need. And in this moment, and this is where I get your comparison, but I'm like, Trump's no Jefferson, right? At this moment, Jefferson, who one of his three defining features of his life that was put on his obelisk at his graveside was, that he was the author of the Bill for Religious Freedom of Virginia, which disestablished religion from government control. Trump, who is trying to become some kind of autocrat with a theocracy is not in the Jeffersonian mold. But if we don't have at least that, we're not going to have religious freedom. But I think what has been exposed is that's not enough. That's not enough to have religious freedom for all people in this country. And so what we need, I think, is this commitment that my freedom is only, it's what Fannie Lou Hamer said. No one's free until everybody's free, right? So the fact that I have freedom is not enough, that everyone has to have the same amount of freedom. And that requires more than a constitutional floor. That requires people really living into the idea that our belonging in this society should be totally disconnected from what we believe religiously.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Trump is no Jefferson, nor is he really a Mussolini. Again, Mussolini
Right.
would be a step up in many ways. But I recently heard John Meacham say that what Trump is doing, strangely, is using Hamiltonian ends for Jeffersonian means, right? Strong central government to dismantle the thing, right? Mm-hmm. To dismantle. And it does seem to me that this anti-government, the government's the enemy, right? The government's the enemy of all that's good, is this libertarianism on steroids. That is Jeffersonian DNA, right? I mean, and when you're the white privileged farmer that's got a lot of stuff, right? you don't need government, right? Jefferson
right.
didn't need a lot from government. It's interesting to think about just who he is, right? And that sort of libertarianism makes sense. I mean, it's anachronistic to call it libertarian, but that impulse, I think, does flow from there. I'm curious. You're a lawyer, and you say in the book, as a kid, you dreamed about, you're precocious. You talk in the book, I love it. You're like, when I look at my kids, I'm like, wow, I was precocious. Like, I was really like it.
Or weird. Maybe
or
that's
straight.
a better
Yeah,
word.
weird as you said it. I didn't say it. I'm wondering, what's your favorite courtroom drama scene? Is there a movie which is like, that's what I want to do? I want to pound on the well. I want to do, what do you have a favorite movie scene that embodies your professional passion?
Oh, wow. I haven't thought about that. I mean, what sprung to mind was To Kill a Mockingbird, but I don't know that that's really animated me in any sort of way. I watched a lot of L.A. Law as a kid.
Great show. Jimmy Smits, Harry Hamlin, dun, 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 had the great theme song.
Yeah, but as a kid, I don't know. I actually really wanted to be a judge as a kid. That was really kind of where I thought my temperament was best kind of aimed, or in the life of politics. And here I am kind of peripheral to both, but involved in getting to be involved in government politics and law. So it's kind of an ideal place for me because, again, it all has to do with religion and religious freedom for me.
Amanda, for our listeners a lot of my listeners are concerned about Christian nationalism. I stay connected to them through social media and stuff, and this is really on their minds, on their hearts. Practically, other than buying your book, which I recommend to all of them, because the book is great. There are practical action steps throughout the book, which I think is fantastic. What's the first action step that you're recommending today in this conversation for people that are listening and just feel overwhelmed and don't know what to do?
Wow. Well, my action step is get involved in your community. And it doesn't even have to be on the issues that we're talking about today. But, I think that there is a tendency in this moment because the overwhelm is the strategy, the idea that, everything's happening and we can't do anything about it. That's very much the strategy, and that's a lie. That's not true. But where we really will have the most impact today is going to be felt on the local level. And so, yeah, stay informed about what's happening in Washington. Understand that, but don't get overwhelmed or too distracted by it, and instead get more engaged in the life of your community, whatever that looks like. It could be in a house of worship. It could be in a community group. It could be in a neighborhood group or something that has to do with your kid's school. But just get more engaged and involved, because I think that's what this moment requires, is that all of us are going to have to be more personally involved in the project of American democracy than we ever have before.
Last question, if there was something that you would recommend right now, something you're reading or a podcast you're listening to, or maybe a think piece in the Atlantic or something that you've just read that you'd want to commend to folks, what would it be?
Wow. Now that's when my mind goes blank, because I feel like I just am.
All right. What are you binge watching right now?
Yeah, there was a time, and I don't think I'm unique. I listened to so many podcasts right before the election, and then I was just like, I need a break. And so I'm kind of coming back to it now. And I'm, you mentioned him earlier. I'm, of course, a big Ezra Klein fan. I also really recommend, especially for those who care about the legal system and what's going on, a podcast called Main Justice that really kind of breaks down what's happening with our justice system. So those are two that's one that's, maybe a little bit more like on the nose as far as law and the Department of Justice. But yeah, those are two places that I kind of get my think pieces and kind of what's gotten me going. But honestly, I think I'm spending a lot of time just talking with a lot of people who are involved in the pro-democracy movement right now, and sharing ideas about how best we can push back and find moments of resistance to what is not just creeping autocracy, but autocracy kind of pounding down the door right now. So that's what I'm doing, and I'd suggest everybody else do the same.
Amanda, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. The book is How to End Christian Nationalism. Everybody run, don't walk to, I was going to say the bookstore, but nobody does that. Quickly open the app, put it on your order list, get it for a friend. It's a great book. Thank you for spending some time talking about it with me.
Thanks for a great conversation.